I'm now going to try and go through figure 4.4 on page 221 in the book. I'm going to start by drawing the top half of the diagram. The axis up here is going to be labeled in dollars. Along this we can measure the wage, or we can measure the value of the marginal productivity of the workers in the firm. Along this line we're going to measure the size of the firm. So what we can do is we can draw a curve which represents the marginal productivity of a worker in the firm as a function of the size of the labor stock in the firm. This means that if they have very few people employed, then then the last worker is adding a lot to the output, and if they have a lot of workers employed, the last worker is adding very little to the output. There is a wage in the market which is exogenous and which is not included in the diagram in the book. And in addition, if you want to hire more people, there is a hiring cost. So we can write that here, plus the hiring cost. And if you want to fire somebody, there is another cost which we can write here. And the way this works is, let's say that you have this many people in the firm. So we go up here, we see what the marginal productivity is. The last worker employed is producing this much for the firm, but they're paying him this much. So they're actually losing this much on that worker. And that is more than the cost of firing him. So they're losing more than it would cost to fire him, so they fire him. And by doing so, they move this way on the curve, and they keep firing people until they come to this point. At this point, on the last worker, they lose this much, but that's the same as the cost of firing him, so it doesn't really make any sense to fire him, because in the end, if you fire at this place, it costs exactly the same to keep him or to fire him. This is the level that we will label LF. A similar argument goes if you're all the way down here. If you have very few people employed, the marginal worker is producing a lot. So he would add this much to the firm. He would cost the firm this much. So the firm would earn a profit that was this much, which is more than the cost of hiring him. So they would hire him and they would move down the curve until they reach this level. So this level is the point that tells us how many people they have hired. They will hire if they have too few people. If they're anywhere in between here, they're losing money or earning money on the worker, the marginal worker, but hiring more workers or firing more workers would incur a hiring cost or a firing cost that would be so large that it doesn't actually make sense. We also note that these costs, hiring costs and the firing costs, can be of different sizes, so that the distance from W up could be quite different from the distance from W down. Okay, so the second half of the diagram is an attempt to add dynamics to this picture. If we draw a 45-degree line, and we say that on this side we have the labor stock in this period, and then down here we will measure the labor stock in the next period. That's what we want to come out of this. So if we just had this 45-degree line, it would mean that no matter what the labor stock was in this period, we would move down and we would move across and we would come to exactly the same level. So for instance, if we take this LH level, if we move down here and then across, we can write LH here. If we move down here with the LF, we can write LF here. Now we know that if the firm employs fewer workers than the LH level, they will move to LH. So any point from in this region should result in us coming to LH. So for instance, if we're here, we move down, we see, and then we see that we move to LH in the next period. If we have more workers than this, than the LF level, if we're all the way up here, for instance, we know that next period we will move to LF, which means that we want this to be a straight line out like this, so that so that will be the case. And finally, in between, we want to follow the 45-degree line, because if we're in between, that means that no matter what our actual level is today, we want to do exactly the same next period, because the cost of adjustment would be higher than the value of adjustment. So that means that if we're on this point in the curve today, the way we read this diagram is we move straight down like this until we reach the red curve. Then we move straight across like this until we see that we are at the LF level. And then we know that next period we will be at the LF level, and then we will stay there until something exogenous happens to either the number of people employed, because some people quit, for instance, or something happens to the technology so that the marginal productivity changes, or so that when something happens to the wage. I hope that was understandable.